What if I told you that a single line, delivered on a London stage by one of Britain's sharpest comedians, made a woman who once married into the most famous family on earth flinch in a way no camera was ever supposed to catch? What if I told you that the joke wasn't even the cruel part? The cruel part was how true it was. The date is late 2025. The venue is packed. Jimmy Carr steps up to the microphone with that thin, knowing smile of his, and in a single sentence, he rewrites how the entertainment world sees Meghan Markle forever. He calls her the original Wallis Simpson. And by the end of this video, you'll know exactly how a duchess who once graced Vogue covers became, in the space of 5 short years, the punchline that every comedian in the English-speaking world reaches for when they need a guaranteed laugh. Before we go any further, hit subscribe, because this story pulls back the curtain on something Hollywood, Netflix, and the Palace have all been quietly trying to bury. Because here's the thing, comedians don't punch at ghosts. They punch at what the audience already believes. And what Jimmy Carr understood long before the numbers came in, long before Netflix quietly walked away from the $100 million deal, long before Spotify let the podcast contract die after a single series, was that the audience had already made up its mind. All he had to do was say it out loud. Let's rewind. Because to understand why the joke lands so hard, you have to understand what came before it. In 2018, Meghan Markle walked down the aisle of St. George's Chapel in Windsor and became, for a brief, shining moment, the most photographed woman in the world. A biracial American actress marrying a British prince. A modern fairy tale in a monarchy allergic to modernity. The world watched, and the world believed. Oprah described her as a breath of fresh air. Vogue put her on the cover as a guest editor. Fashion writers competed to name the color of her coats. She was, in every measurable way, a phenomenon. And then, slowly at first, and then all at once, something shifted. The exit from royal duties in early 2020. The move to Canada, then to California. The Oprah interview in March 2021, watched by 17 million Americans. The claims, the counterclaims, the tearful admissions, the palace silence. For a while, the sympathy held. For a while, the narrative was still hers to shape. But here's where the story takes a turn nobody expected. Because comedy, unlike journalism, doesn't wait for lawyers. Comedy sniffs the wind. And by 2022, the wind had changed. Chris Rock stepped onto a Netflix stage for his special Selective Outrage. And he did something that shocked even his own audience. He looked out at the crowd and he talked about Meghan. He talked about the racism claims. And then he delivered the line that would echo through green rooms for years afterward. He called it the light-skinned lottery. He said some of it might be racism, sure, but some of it was just, in his words, in-law problems. He said the whole family calling her the wrong things wasn't a Klan rally, it was an awkward Thanksgiving. The audience roared, and in that roar, you could hear something shifting in the culture. The untouchable was, suddenly, very much touchable. Think about that for a moment. Chris Rock, a black American comedian, one of the sharpest observers of race in modern entertainment, standing on a global stage and gently, almost affectionately, dismantling the central pillar of the Sussex narrative. Not with cruelty, with familiarity. As if to say, we've all had this in-law. We all know this story. It isn't a fairy tale. It's a family group chat. And once Chris Rock said it, everyone else felt permission to follow. Saturday Night Live took the next swing. In a sketch that went viral for reasons the Sussexes probably wish it hadn't, the show mocked the endless string of Meghan and Harry projects. The documentaries, the interviews, the podcasts, the specials, the memoir, the follow-up memoir. The punchline, delivered with that flat SNL deadpan, was that the only difference between their new show and their old show was that people watched this one. A single sentence, a studio audience howling, and somewhere in Montecito, one imagines, a very quiet kitchen. Bill Maher, never one to soften a blow, took his own turn on Real Time. He questioned the endless victimhood narrative. He questioned the branding. He questioned whether a couple who claimed to want privacy could really justify a Netflix docuseries, a Spotify podcast, an Oprah interview, a South Park episode's worth of media saturation, all while insisting they'd been driven from public life. He didn't shout. He didn't sneer. He just asked. And in the asking, he made the contradiction impossible to unsee. Andrew Schultz went harder. Schultz, the Brooklyn comedian who built his empire on saying the unsayable, tore into the couple in special after special, podcast after podcast. He mocked the accents. He mocked the interviews. He mocked the idea that anyone still cared. And crucially, his young, digital native audience laughed along. Because for them, Meghan and Harry weren't royals. They were just two more content creators in a saturated market, and not particularly successful ones at that. And then came South Park. In February 2023, Trey Parker and Matt Stone aired an episode titled The Worldwide Privacy Tour. It featured a red-haired prince and his American actress wife traveling the globe demanding, at ear-splitting volume, that everyone stop looking at them. The prince held up signs that read, "We want privacy, and stop looking at us." The wife, described in episode as sorority girl, actress, influencer, victim, was portrayed as relentlessly ambitious, relentlessly on camera, relentlessly desperate for the attention she claimed to be fleeing. The episode was one of the most watched of the season. It trended on every platform. And here's the part nobody expected. There was no lawsuit. There was no cease and desist that stuck. There was only silence from Montecito, and that silence spoke louder than any denial ever could. Ask yourself something. When does a public figure stop being a person and start being a punchline? When does the cultural verdict harden into concrete? Because somewhere between Chris Rock's Netflix special and South Park's animated skewering, that verdict was already set. All Jimmy Carr had to do, years later, was carve it into stone. If you've made it this far, hit like, because what comes next is the part of the story that even seasoned royal watchers underestimated. It's the part where the numbers stopped lying, and where the culture's whispered joke became the industry's open secret. Because in 2025, the receipts finally arrived. And they arrived in the coldest, most unromantic form imaginable. Streaming metrics. With Love, Meghan launched on Netflix in the spring of 2025. It was pitched as a lifestyle series, a warm, sunlit meditation on cooking, entertaining, friendship, and gracious living from the Duchess of Sussex herself. The trailers were beautiful, the Montecito kitchen was luminous, the guest list was impressive, and then the show aired. The critic score settled at 36% on Rotten Tomatoes. Reviewers described it as flat, curated, oddly hollow, a lifestyle show without a discernible lifestyle beneath it. But critical reception, as Netflix executives will tell you, isn't what matters. Viewership is. And viewership, that most brutal of arbiters, delivered its verdict. By the end of 2025, With Love, Meghan finished the year ranked number 383 on Netflix's own internal engagement charts. Not inside the top 300, not inside the top 350. 383. Below reruns. Below foreign language dramas most subscribers had never heard of. Below the algorithmic scrap heap where streaming projects go to be quietly forgotten. And here's where the story takes another turn nobody expected. The reported $100 million Netflix deal, the one announced with such fanfare in 2020, the one that was going to reshape prestige streaming, the one that was going to prove the Sussexes were more valuable outside the palace than inside it, was quietly not renewed. There was no press conference, no emotional farewell post, no statement of mutual respect, just the slow, professional silence of a partnership allowed to expire. The kind of silence that in Hollywood is louder than any breakup. The Spotify partnership had already met a similar fate. Archewell Audio, the podcast venture, ended after a single completed series. Insiders described the split with a phrase that has since become infamous in podcasting circles. The details vary in the retelling, but the gist was the same. The output didn't justify the investment. One series, one expensive lesson, and this is the moment the comedians had been waiting for. Because comedy needs proof. Comedy needs a scoreboard. Comedy needs a receipt it can wave in the audience's face and say, "Look, I told you." And in late 2025, every comedian in the English-speaking world suddenly had that receipt. Enter Jimmy Carr. Picture the scene. The theater is dark. The audience is hot with anticipation, because Carr is the master of the perfectly weighted line, the joke that seems to arrive fully formed, as if he'd merely found it lying on the pavement rather than crafted it. He walks the stage. He addresses the audience. And then, in that dry, unhurried voice, he begins. He calls her the lifelong feminist who gave up her job. The line is delivered without malice, which is what makes it devastating. He doesn't shout it. He offers it, almost as an observation, as if he's genuinely puzzled by the arithmetic of it. A woman who campaigned, publicly and repeatedly, for female empowerment, for career, for independence, walking away from her acting career, then from her royal working role, then from most of her Hollywood ventures. The audience laughs, but it's a knowing laugh. The kind of laugh that means the joke wasn't discovered by Carr. It was confirmed by him. Then he calls them the Royal Kardashians. And here's where the comedy sharpens into something closer to cultural diagnosis. Because the Kardashian comparison lands not as an insult, but as a category error corrected in real time. The Sussexes had insisted, for 5 years, that they were reformers, that they were storytellers, that they were a modern royal couple carving out a new path. Carr, in 3 words, reframes them as something else entirely. Reality-adjacent celebrities monetizing their proximity to a title they no longer perform the duties of. The audience roars, because the reframing feels overdue. Then comes the line about spending your money in the UK and Canada. A jab at the persistent stories about British and Canadian taxpayer contributions to security, to renovations, to the infrastructure of a royal life the couple had officially exited. It's a political joke wrapped in a personal one, and it draws blood because it echoes complaints that have been circulating in the British press for years, but stated now with the unforgiving compression of stand-up. But it's the final bit, the historical bit, the bit that lands hardest, that turns Carr's set from a roast into something closer to a cultural verdict. He talks about Wallis Simpson. Stay with this, because the history matters. In 1936, Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee, became the woman whose relationship with King Edward VIII triggered the abdication crisis, the constitutional earthquake that nearly toppled the British monarchy. She was blamed, unfairly by some accounts, savagely by others, for pulling a king from his throne. She was cast as the outsider, the American, the interloper, the woman who couldn't play by the rules of an ancient institution and so shattered it instead. And Jimmy Carr looks at his audience, pauses for that immaculate Carr beat, and delivers the line. Wallis Simpson, he says, was the original Meghan Markle. 80 years early, the theater erupts, and somewhere in that eruption, a piece of cultural furniture is rearranged permanently. Because with one sentence, Carr has done what 100 columnists and biographers had failed to do. He has slotted Meghan Markle into a historical archetype she cannot argue her way out of. The American divorcee, the Hollywood outsider, the woman the monarchy could not absorb. The comparison isn't even mean. It's structural. It's almost anthropological. And that's why it hurts. Now, the reports that emerged afterward, the ones that traveled across social media in the small hours, described Meghan in tears. Whether those reports are literal or whether they're the shorthand of a culture translating the emotional weight of a moment into an easily shared headline, the underlying truth was harder to dispute. A line had been crossed. A joke had landed. And it had landed in a way that made even the couple's most loyal defenders quietly step away from the comments section. Because think about it. When Chris Rock said it, it was one comedian. When SNL said it, it was one sketch. When South Park said it, it was one animated episode. But when Jimmy Carr said it, and the audience laughed the way they laughed, it wasn't one comedian anymore. It was the culture speaking through him, a consensus that had been forming, quietly, cumulatively, for years, suddenly finding its most concise expression on a single stage, on a single night. And then Kelly Osbourne stepped in and turned the temperature up again. On a daytime talk panel, Osbourne, never one to filter herself, made a comment about Prince Harry that reportedly made her own co-hosts fall silent. It wasn't the volume that startled them, it was the specificity. She questioned the intelligence of the decisions he had made. She questioned the influence he had allowed. She questioned the man he had allowed himself to become. And the silence that followed, that awkward, television-dead silence, was the sound of professional broadcasters realizing that the cultural rules had changed, and they hadn't been sent the memo. Here's what royal watchers pointed out in the days afterward. The Sussex's brand was built on emotional accessibility, on vulnerability, on the idea that they were, unlike the stiff figures of Buckingham Palace, human, relatable, modern. But the comedians had turned that same accessibility into a weapon. If you insist on being human on camera, you can be laughed at like a human on camera. If you insist on being a brand, you can be roasted like a brand. The very intimacy the couple had cultivated was now the tinder for every joke. And Netflix, Spotify, and the rest of the streaming ecosystem noticed. Because streaming platforms are not sentimental institutions. They are, in the end, spreadsheets with logos. And the spreadsheet had spoken. 383rd place. One completed podcast series. $100 million deal quietly retired. A partnership walked away from, with all the ceremony of a supermarket loyalty card being canceled. Ask yourself something. What does a fall look like in the age of streaming? It doesn't look like a public disgrace. It doesn't look like a scandal that dominates the front pages for a week. It looks like a slow, algorithmic drift downward. It looks like the ranking chart that used to show you in the top 10, then the top 50, then the top 100, then nowhere at all. It looks like the offers that used to arrive weekly, then monthly, then quarterly, then not at all. It looks like the comedians who used to be careful with your name, now saying it with the easy shrug of someone who knows the audience is on their side. That's what the Jimmy Carr moment revealed. Not a single joke, a verdict already reached, articulated at last. Now, in the aftermath of that set, and the clips that circulated for weeks afterward, something else began to shift. Because the Sussex team, according to those monitoring the family's internal communications, understood that the old playbook wasn't working. The old playbook was to respond, to counterbrief, to release a heartfelt interview, to lean into vulnerability. But every attempt at that playbook in 2025 had produced diminishing returns. The docuseries had been mocked. The lifestyle show had flopped. The memoir's follow-up interest had faded. And the comedians, sensing weakness the way comedians always do, had only sharpened. And so the strategy, sources close to the couple suggested, changed. Silence, withdrawal, fewer interviews, fewer projects. A pivot toward philanthropic work that couldn't be mocked as easily. A retreat from the very cameras that had built the brand and then dismantled it. But here's the tragic irony. Silence, for a brand built on speaking out, reads as defeat. And defeat, in the entertainment industry, is the one narrative the comedians love most. Because it gives them the ending they always wanted. Think about what this means for the wider story of the monarchy. Because whatever your view of Meghan Markle, whatever your view of the exit from royal life, whatever your view of Oprah and the Netflix documentary and the memoir, the cultural reception of the Sussexes has become a case study in how the modern celebrity contract works. You can leave the palace. You can move to California. You can sign the deals. You can give the interviews. But you cannot control how the culture eventually decides to remember you. That decision is made in comedy clubs, in animated cartoons, in late-night monologues, in the small cumulative weight of 1,000 jokes told in 1,000 rooms. And that decision, by late 2025, had been made. The Wallace-Simpson comparison, once it left Jimmy Carr's mouth, took on a life of its own. It appeared in newspaper columns. It appeared in academic panels on modern monarchy. It appeared in the captions of social media clips shared millions of times. And royal historians, some of whom had defended Meghan for years, began, cautiously, to admit that the parallel was more than a joke. It was a pattern. The American outsider. The divorce, the Hollywood pull. The strain on a monarchy trying and struggling to adapt to a media age it did not fully understand. Except this time, there was no abdication. This time, the monarchy did not fall. The monarchy simply, quietly, absorbed the shock, closed ranks, and moved on. King Charles continued his reign. William and Catherine continued their rise as the new center of gravity. And the Sussexes, once positioned as the modern face of the family, found themselves increasingly on the outside of a story they had once believed was theirs to tell. And here's the emotional truth of it. Because whatever the jokes, whatever the rankings, whatever the streaming metrics, there is a human being at the center of this story. A woman who married a prince, believed in a fairy tale, tried to reshape an institution she never fully understood, and found herself, 5 years later, as the punchline in a Jimmy Carr set. Whether you sympathize with her or not, that arc is genuinely, cinematically tragic. It has the shape of a Shakespearean fall. And that, more than any single joke, is what the culture has been trying, in its own crude and comic way, to articulate. So what happens now? Because the story doesn't end with Jimmy Carr. Comedians move on. Audiences move on. Streaming charts refresh every week. The question is whether the Sussexes can find a second act, a genuine one built not on the residual glamour of a title they no longer perform, but on something more durable. Philanthropy, reinvention, a quieter, more considered public life. Some royal watchers believe it's possible. Others believe the brand damage is now too structural to repair. And there's one more person we haven't talked about yet. Because behind every joke aimed at Meghan, there sits a quieter, more painful question about Harry. About the prince who left his family, his country, his uniform, his charities, for a life in California that has, by any measurable standard, not delivered what he was promised. About the letters he may or may not have written home. About the reconciliation his father, in the twilight of his reign, may or may not still be waiting for. That story, the story of the son who walked away and the family that watched him go, is one we'll be unpacking in full very soon. If you've made it this far, hit like, because stories like this don't stay buried for long. And the culture is only just beginning to say out loud what it whispered for years. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because the next chapter, the one about Harry and the quiet reckoning inside the palace walls, is the one that may finally answer the question everyone has been afraid to ask. Because in the end, the cruelest joke is never the one the comedian tells. It's the one the audience already believed before he opened his mouth. Jimmy Carr didn't build the verdict on Meghan Markle. He only read it aloud. And once a verdict is read aloud, in a theater full of laughing strangers, it is very, very hard to appeal. The lights go down. The audience files out. Somewhere in Montecito, a phone lights up with the clip, and a woman who once stood on the steps of St. George's Chapel, radiant in white, watched by billions, learns what every fallen icon eventually learns. The world claps you in. And one day, without warning, it laughs you out.